Hello, and welcome to the presentation Data Governance Foundation for Analytics. This was originally presented at the EDUCAUSE Enterprise Summit on Analytics, the theme of which was collaboration. And so this presentation is really meant to stress the amount of collaboration that is required to put data governance in place and how data governance is very important to be able to do analytics effectively. So in case you need to be reminded, it's all about the data. Every organization. So for example, let's talk about cheese. How do you count cheese? What on earth does that mean? Well, when I was first in this role, and then first chief data officer at the University of Rochester, one of the people I needed to be able to have a conversation with was someone on our board of trustees who happens to work in the retail space. And so talking about the challenges of managing higher education data was a little lost on the people I had to talk to. So I really wanted to put it in terms that other folks can understand. So, for example, Kraft Parmesan cheese. That's what the label on the front of the container says. Is this cheese? And that's a great question. I put it on my spaghetti, and the label says that it's cheese. It's something that we order from a supplier, and it comes shipped to us and sits on a shelf. What about this? Well, this looks more like cheese. It looks very similar to what's in the Kraft container, but it's branded by the store, which means that at some point somebody had to take cheese and repackage it in these store branded containers. Maybe they actually did the grading themselves. Maybe they had bulk graded stuff and they had to repackage it. So it's generally found not on the shelf, but in the refrigerated containers. Now, I'm pretty sure most people would assert that that block of Parmesan is in fact cheese. And so let's say, for example, you wanted to have some information about your cheese sales. You also probably have some information about how much cheese is in somebody's shopping cart. Most of the grocery stores you go to now have some sort of reward system that can track the purchases and tie them directly to a particular customer. And if you don't have a rewards card, they're still tracking what it is that people purchase together. So we've got all kinds of information about what people buy in terms of cheese. So what if the USDA asks you how much cheese do you sell? How do you answer that question? Well, in order to do that, you need to actually do cheese math. And cheese math may sound very simple, except for the part where it isn't always. So, for example, are these three things the same? I know that lots of people don't consider the prepackaged, heavily processed, full of preservatives version that Kraft puts out to be real food, for example. I've had several people suggest to me that I use Cheez Whiz as an example, but that to me is too far out into the realm of not really being food, that I don't want to touch that one. So how do we actually think about these? If these things are all considered cheese, if we all consider them the same thing, they're all Parmesan cheese, how do we add them together? Is it by unit? Is it by weight? Is it by volume? Is it by price? We've got lots and lots of different ways to think about these individual things. I'm not sure how it is that you'd actually add up all of your cheese. Okay, and so this gets to the heart of the challenge. What data do you have about cheese? Where does it live? So as I said, we probably have the Kraft information in a purchasing system. We may have the store brand Parmesan in a processing system. And we probably have the block of cheese in a completely different sourcing system because it probably comes from a different kind of distributor. And so just counting up the cheese that we have or the cheese that we have sold in the past is hard enough. What if we wanted to actually predict cheese sales as well, right? So there's a lot of conversation around predictive analytics, not just where are we now and where have we been, but where are we going to be in the future. And if we can't get the math right to understand our current state, there's no way we can get the math right to understand our future state. Well, at the University of Rochester, we actually care more about students than we do about cheese. Although I will guarantee you, you will never be able to look at cheese on a salad bar again without wondering how you would count that cheese. And so we do a lot in our institutional reporting environments to create reports about our current students. We're very interested in understanding bio and demographic information, what enrollment trends are, course loads, all that sort of stuff. What we'd really like to be able to do is not just look at the current state and where we have been, but actually do a little bit more on the predictive analytics perspective to help support good student outcomes. Not just who's going to enroll, but can we pinpoint people who are having trouble? Can we understand who might be in danger of not being successful so that we can do more to support them? The challenge is we don't have a single view of student. Now, in the corporate data world, if you go to any of these big data conferences, the holy grail is the single view of customer. And they'll talk a lot about how the marketing folks and the accounts receivable folks have different information about about customers. So in the university world, we don't have customers in the same way that the corporate world does, but that's not to say that we don't have the same kinds of challenges. So for example, who are these students? We've got bio-demo information on them from registered students. They're managed by the registrar. We have information on applicants as part of the application system, and some of those students who apply actually become active students, and so we've got different information from different parts of the application process in two different systems. If we want to know how healthy they are, we may have information on them in the student health services system. But that may not be all of the students. We may have some students that get health care off campus, and so therefore they may not appear in that system at all. What do they do outside class? Well, our student services and student activities folks probably have a pretty good idea of who's signed up for what, but they've got a different system entirely that they use to actually handle registrations and signups and track participation and things like that. And then we've got the idea of what is the financial picture for these students. And so we've got the bursar's office is going to handle all of the accounts receivable type of information, the billing and the payments, but we have a completely separate system and a completely separate business process for financial aid that helps to manage all of those things. So for each of these kinds of information about students, they're part of separate business processes that all exist for very important functions to support the university, and they all have different processes and different platforms that those things happen in. And so if we really wanted to have a comprehensive picture of the student, we need to figure out how to put all of this information together, not just from a technology, how do we connect the systems perspective, but also from a data definitions, how do we know that these are all measuring the same thing perspective. And so at the University of Rochester, the journey began. So this happened several years before I came on board, which was in July of 2018. And every journey story has some great acronyms. And so the first thing is this notion of awareness. And everybody that you talk to here will tell you we are a decentralized institution. We have 8 different schools that basically function semi-autonomously. We have a hospital that is a different beast altogether, and so there's lots of decisions being made in lots of different places without necessarily good communication across them. So once that people are aware of the fact that this is a challenge, especially from a data perspective, they acknowledge that it's complicated. And that's the two most popular things that people told me about when I first got here was we're decentralized and everything is complicated. So both of those are true, but eventually what has to happen is that you've got this growing acceptance that while those two things may be true, they're not. It's not a reason for not doing something. And so there's an acceptance that if we really want to get our data under control and get our hands around it, we have to do something. And so several years before I came on board, there was this decision that was made that somebody needs to be in charge of all of this. They had had several people and several committees working part-time trying to do data governance for a long time, and that was just not being successful for them. And so after the awareness, the acknowledgement, and the acceptance, they had to act. So they decided they were going to hire a chief data officer to fix it. And so that's where I come in. But as important as I think the chief data officer role is, and I do think it is very important, I don't care whether that's the title or not, but having somebody who is in a senior enough position that they can take the university's perspective and think about things without being embedded in a particular silo and actually be able to take a bird's eye view and think strategically about data uses data sourcing and data definitions, I think is really critical to just about any kind of organization. That said, it's not something I can do by myself. I can't fix anything independently. So, for example, why can't I do anything by myself? Well, if we want to be able to get that view, the view of student, we might have to actually have two different software systems talk to each other, and that's an integration. But guess what? In order to integrate two systems, you need to have permissions by the people who own the two systems or who operate the two systems in order to do so. And so I need to get those two people to talk to each other. If we want to have an understanding of the standard, say, definitions for things, that requires the people who might be using the data and it might have definitions, they agree on what that standard is, which means I need to get all of those affected parties to talk to each other. If we want to do a better job of sharing data, even if we're not talking about system-to-system integration, but we're just talking about you have information that I need, it requires an set up level of understanding between the two parts of the organization that are trying to share data. And that requires people to talk to each other. And if you want to get people to work together to make all of this happen, it requires trust. And guess what? Trust also requires people to talk to each other. So since I can't do this alone, I've decided that I am going to enlist some of my new best friends. So for example, my role is in the provost's office, which is the academic affairs side of the house. But I work very, very closely with the deputy CIO, who is in the information technology world. And so one of the reasons why we work so closely together is because anything that resembled data governance before I got here was by default being done by the IT staff, who are constantly being asked to let me have access to that database, and can you give me this because you have all the keys to the kingdom behind the scenes. And so it's really, really important that people understand that data and technology are two separate issues, two separate items. Okay, data exists regardless of the technology platform that they may live on, but technology is really important for data to be able to be useful. And so working with the deputy CIO helps us to keep the data and the technology aligned. I also work very closely with the Associate Vice Provost for Institutional Research. He and I both report up to the Vice Provost for Research, and he works with me on understanding what are our reporting requirements, what are the things that we need to be able to do for the Department of Education, for the state boards and agencies to whom we are accountable. And so it's really important that I understand what the requirements are and what outside agencies that we work with are expecting from us, so that I can understand how what we're doing may or may not actually meet that. My two other colleagues that I work incredibly closely with are the head of metadata strategies in our library and our information architect, who also lives in IT, because they actually help me think about and describe models of what information looks like. So when we talk about a student, what do we mean by student? And it sounds very foundational, except for the part where it's not. Is a student somebody who is a full-time student? Is it somebody who is taking a class right now? Is it somebody who's taken a class recently? How long do you have to wait before you become a student, between when you're admitted and when you show up? All of these things are really important, and actually thinking conceptually about what these definitions are and how we describe things is super important to being able to get focus and be able to describe things and understand the data that we have. And so these are the people that I work on all the shuns with. So the first one is the obvious: communication. As I said, one of the biggest challenges in doing this, trying to do anything with data governance in a decentralized organization, whether it be in academia or anywhere else, is getting people to talk to each other. And so one of my biggest things that I've done since I've gotten here is talking to a lot of different people and understanding what the issues are and understanding what their business processes are and their perspectives, and getting people to talk to each other. But that actually isn't enough, because I'm sure that there's been lots of instances where you've been in a conversation with someone and you're pretty sure that you're on the same page, and then somebody who was in that conversation goes off and does something that doesn't meet at all what you thought they just talked about. And so one of the things that I've found is documentation is super helpful. So once you've actually gotten the communication piece, actually writing things down and making sure that everybody really does understand what you all agreed to, or what the definition of something is, or what the plan is for going forward, is really the most important thing. Even though you might have a verbal agreement, I will guarantee you that when you actually sit down and put it into words, somebody who was part of that conversation is going to be like, that's not what I meant. And so having it written down in express language that people can tweak and play with is going to get you to a place where you can actually have cooperation, right? And that's the idea of working together. If you don't have the ability to communicate both orally and verbally, then you're never going to be able to work together effectively. And I've got a great example of how this actually played out in my world. So, for example, we had, when I got here, a project in Train to do to be able to create a master location data set, understanding all of the places on campus, how to describe them, what do they look like. And you would think that sounds really easy, except for the part where it's not. So not only did we have that particular project in Train, we're also in the process of replacing our student information system, the process, the platform that actually allows us to register students and schedule classes and put them in classrooms. So one of the things that we needed for our new student processes was instructional space. We needed to understand which rooms in which buildings on which parts of campus were actually going to be used to hold classes. And so when I got here, there was a whole bunch of conversations about, we're going to program this, we're going to program that, and a lot of confusion around how to do data capture, because they hadn't actually sat down and started thinking about what it was they were trying to capture. So I got a bunch of people in a room and started talking about, all right, what is a building? What do we mean by that? What is a room? How do we relate rooms to buildings? How do we collect information that describes what a building looks like? And so one of the things we did was actually to create a conceptual model that sounds like it's a little bit overkill and very kindergartner or first grade-ish, but the whole notion of being able to describe things like a campus has zones. There's parts of a campus. Inside that zone, you're going to have a building. Inside that building, there's going to be floors. Inside those floors, there are going to be rooms. Oh, well, wait a minute. Some of our floors don't have rooms. They have suites. And a suite has a door in the front and it opens up and maybe there's cubicles inside. And so even down to that level, assuming that everybody knows that all buildings have floors and rooms was not sufficient. And so once we had this sort of basic understanding of what the components of locations on campus actually meant, we were able to meet with a whole bunch of stakeholders, our facilities folks, our space planning folks, our instructional staff, our event management staff, everybody who thinks about places on campus and say, this is what we think it is. This is what we think this is how we think these things put together. And by the way, how are we defining these things specifically? So we rolled out, what is a building? And we had a conversation about what that looks like. And guess what? We didn't have a documented conversation, a documented definition for building. So we got some general agreement on what building is, and we wrote it down, and we sent it to a whole bunch of people who work in this area. And somebody came back and said, by the way, that's not the definition of building. Believe it or not, the Department of Education has a standard definition for what is considered a post-secondary institution building. And so once we had it written down, the details, we were able to get some information from somebody who wasn't part of the initial conversation, and it's not clear that if they were part of the initial conversation, they would have cottoned on to the details, but to say, you need to define buildings the way that the Department of Education defines buildings. Excellent. So we were able to take that feedback, adapt the definition to meet our federal requirements, and then use that as a basis to go out and be able to identify which spaces within those buildings could be used for teaching and instruction. And that information then gets built into the student information system. All of this work took, believe it or not, weeks and months, and it was all just to define and understand one data element that appears in one business process. Super important, super foundational, but potentially super complicated. But it does require collaboration. And in all of these meetings and in all of these conversations, there were certain principles that we had to lay out in order to get people to be able to work together effectively. And these are things that I make very clear whenever I start on a project with people, especially stuff around data, because people sometimes feel very strongly about things. So the first principle is that everybody gets a say, but not everybody gets their way. By definition, when you have a large group of stakeholders and you're trying to come to a common agreement, if you've got 20 or 30 people as part of a work group, and that's the size of my data governance council, it's 30 people from across all parts, all the different schools, all of the different departments, and everything else, there is going to be, almost by creation, people who have diametrically opposed opinions on things. And so one of the reasons that the chief data officer role is so important is because somebody has to be the one to listen to all of the different opinions, figure out what is the thing that makes the most sense. In my mind, it's what causes the least pain, and say that's the way we're going to do this. So everybody gets to have a voice, but not everybody gets to have the outcome be what it is that they want. And people need to come into a collaborative environment understanding that that's the way it's going to work, or else feelings are going to get hurt. Second principle is that you're not a special snowflake. Almost without exception, every time we start on a collaboration and we find something that sounds like it's going to work for most of the people, and I've heard all of the voices and said, this is the decision, somebody will raise their hand and say, well, that you don't understand, that's not going to work for us, we're special. And guess what? There are very, very few really special snowflakes. Another version of this rule is the 80-20 rule. We're going to do what we can to provide a reasonable collaborative solution that's going to meet 80% of the needs. And we'll figure out what to do with the 20% after that first thing is decided. Because in my experience, one of the things that I found is that once you identify that 80%, the solution that meets 80%, about 19 of the remaining 20% realize that there's no reason why with a few small tweaks they can't use the common solution as well. There is still going to be the 1% of people for whom there are really good business reasons to do things differently, but those people should be dealt with in special cases as exceptions rather than putting their case forward as part of the conversation to help set what the rule is. And then everybody also needs to understand that drama doesn't equal damage. This was a point that I have quite blatantly stolen from the campus data steward at the University of Notre Dame, who has used this to help people get over their fear of data sharing. But I found it to be very helpful in lots and lots of situations. There's lots of times when you're working on a collaborative project and somebody isn't comfortable with the solution, it makes them uncomfortable. And they say, oh, I don't know, so-and-so is not going to like that. Or that's going to make so-and-so feel bad. Or this doesn't feel right. And I don't want to discount anybody's feelings, but when you're actually trying to get stuff done, you need to have a different bar than people will feel bad. Because guess what? All of this is about change, and change is uncomfortable. And so the standard that we use is what we are proposing to do going to cause harm to someone? Is it going to cause damage to a school or a department or the university or someone's career or something like that? And if it is not going to cause damage, not actually going to cause harm, it is just going to cause discomfort, then we don't rule it out entirely. I'm not going to say we're going to discount it completely, but we're not going to say we can't pursue this particular solution because it makes somebody feel uncomfortable or is going to cause drama in some part of the university. So following on these principles, that allows us to go through and say, okay, we can now build on these foundations to get to where we want to be. And where we want to be is that institutional data need to be securely accessible, trusted, and understood in order for effective analytics to explain and improve how the university works. All of these things need to happen before you even get to the analysis, before you can have your dashboards, before you can have your reports. Because guess what? Tableau doesn't make the decision for you about what is the definition of full-time student. You need to do that first. Okay? There isn't a BI tool out there or an analytics tool or a coding language that is able to address these kinds of definitional and conceptual challenges. You need to do that first. If you have a good data governance program, it can help you focus the collaboration and formalize the cooperation to provide the solid foundation. And so none of this stuff can happen in a vacuum. Everybody needs to be part of a solution. Because guess what? Even Dorothy needed help getting to the Emerald City. People who know me and have heard me talk about these kinds of topics before will know that I love to torture the Wizard of Oz analogy to death. I can see the Emerald City. I know what it could look like and how effective and efficient we could be at advancing our goals, doing better research, providing better patient care, having better student outcomes if we have good data to work with. And that's where I want to go. And I see myself as Dorothy, and I'm helping to get us to the Emerald City and protect us from the flying monkeys and the evil trees and the wicked witch and the poppies and all of those sorts of things. But even Dorothy couldn't get to the Emerald City by herself. She needed the Scarecrow. She needed the Tin Man. For some reason, she needed the Cowardly Lion, even though I'm not quite sure what he contributed. But when you do these things together and you've got a good set of conversations, set of documentations, and you work collaboratively to be able to do this foundational work of understanding and describing your data, then you're in a much better place to be able to make sure that your analytics are solid and the predictions and the descriptions that you get out of those are ones that will actually help you be efficient, effective, and move forward in the way that you want to go. So that's my story. That's the cheese story that ends up with my Wizard of Oz story. And thank you for taking the time to listen.